behind the majestic halls of the Vatican, beyond the white robes and grand public blessings, lies a story few dare to tell. The story of Robert Francis Prevost, a man who wore the crown of spiritual leadership, but also carried the crushing weight of human imperfection, long before the world called him Pope Leo XIV. He walked the crowded streets of Chicago and the sun-drenched alleys of Peru, wrestling with choices that would later echo through the marble halls of the Vatican. He was a man torn between doctrine and compassion, between the towering expectations of the Church and the quiet, often painful whispers of his own conscience. While the world watched his rise, they never saw the sleepless nights, the hands clenched in silent prayer, the decisions made alone, in rooms darker than any cathedral's shadow. And though history remembers his titles, it forgets his tears. It forgets the man. Today, we open that hidden chapter, not to judge, not to condemn, but to understand. Because every leader, even a pope, has a cross unseen by the world. So stay with me as we walk the silent corridors into the heart of a struggle few have ever witnessed. This is the untold story of the hidden struggles of Pope Leo XIV. The first controversy, shadows in Chicago and Peru, before he stood beneath the golden ceilings of the Vatican. Before the world addressed him as Pope Leo XIV, Robert Francis Prevost walked through two cities, each hiding shadows he could never quite escape. Chicago, a city of ambition, and Peru's sun-scorched Chiclayo, a place where hope and hardship met in every dusty corner. In these places, he faced not just the sins of men, but the crushing silence of an institution slow to change. One case after another, allegations, whispers, stories that no man of faith ever hopes to hear. Yet, there he stood, not as a judge, but as a man, trapped between policy and his own trembling conscience. They say he moved too slowly, that he waited when swift action was needed. But can you imagine holding the weight of ruined lives while bound by ancient laws written long before your time? In the quiet halls of the archdiocese and under the unforgiving sun of Chiclayo, he asked himself, do I obey the chain of command or break it to protect the innocent? But every decision carried consequences. To act too fast meant defiance. To wait too long meant guilt he could never wash away. And so, history remembers him as the man who walked too carefully through a field of broken glass. But tell me, if you stood in his place, what would you have done? Because sometimes the hardest step is the one you're too afraid to take. The decision that haunted him. There are decisions that live quietly in the corners of memory. And there are others that haunt every silent night. For Robert Francis Prevost, one decision became his lifelong shadow. A name, Father James Ray. The allegations were known, serious, alarming, but bound by layers of bureaucracy. He hesitated. Instead of exile, instead of distance, Father Ray was allowed to remain, a stone's throw from a Catholic school. Was it a moment of weakness or a man? Trapped beneath the suffocating weight of outdated laws and rigid hierarchy? Each day that passed brought whispers, and with them, a growing storm inside his heart. He sat alone many nights at a simple wooden desk, the moonlight streaming through the window, hands clasped tightly, eyes closed against the crushing regret. Should he have acted sooner? Could one decision have changed the course of a life? But regret does not rewrite history. It only echoes in the chambers of the soul. This was the decision that haunted him, not written on official records, but etched forever in the silent confessions of a man who wore the whitest robes, yet carried the darkest burdens. The battle with his own order, leadership, is never just about standing before the world. Sometimes it's about standing against your own. For Robert Francis Prevost, this was the loneliest battlefield, not against outsiders, but within his very own order. The case was Richard McGrath, a name that brought shame and a silence heavier than stone walls. Prevost knew the accusations. He heard the pleas, felt the growing anger, but again, the chains of ancient procedure held him back. He walked the corridors of his own order, once filled with brotherhood and purpose, now echoing with distrust and quiet resentment. To act against one of their own was not just a decision, it was a betrayal in their eyes. Yet to stay silent was to betray his own conscience. He stood at that crossroad, alone. Not a single council member, not a single brother was willing to take the first step. History is harsh with its judgments. It remembers his hesitation. It rarely remembers the impossible choices behind it. At night, in those long candlelit halls, he often wondered, had he acted too late? Or had the weight of his own order simply been too heavy to lift alone? This was the battle no one saw. The silent war, Hent fought in empty corridors, palm fives, and in the quiet chambers of a heart divided. A stand still debated his view on women's role in the church. Among the many battles Robert Francis Prevost faced one that divided hearts more than any other: the question of women's place within the ancient walls of the church. He believed that leadership should never be defined by gender alone. He spoke often of the extraordinary strength and quiet resilience of the women who kept faith alive in the darkest of times. But when asked directly, should women stand where priests have stood for centuries? He paused, and his answer was not what many hoped to hear. He upheld tradition, the centuries-old doctrine that reserved the priesthood for men, not out of arrogance, not from a place of dismissal, but from a belief that some walls are not torn down by force. He believed change must begin within hearts before it can be written into law, so he took a different stand. He opened the doors of leadership in every place except the altar. He appointed women to high councils. He welcomed their voices into rooms where they had long been absent. And he listened, truly listened. When they spoke of a church that often forgot its most faithful servants. Was it enough? Some say it was only a half measure. Others call it the beginning of a quiet revolution, and perhaps that was his greatest struggle. Standing on the threshold between two worlds, one hand holding firm to the pillars of ancient tradition, the other reaching forward toward a future not yet written. In the end, he left that question unresolved, a debate still echoing through the marble halls, and whispered in every silent prayer for change.
Struggles to unify a divided church. Unity, a word spoken so easily from the pulpit, yet lived so painfully in the real world. For Pope Leo XIV, unity was not just a sermon, it was a battlefield where every step forward felt like a tightrope walk above a chasm of division. On one side, North America, progressive, demanding reform, a future church where voices long silenced could finally be heard. On the other, South America, rooted in tradition, guarding sacred rituals, as if each were the final thread, holding the fabric of faith together. And between them, he stood, one man, one fragile bridge between two worlds, pulling in opposite directions. He traveled endlessly, from the marble halls of New York to the humble chapels of Lima, listening, always listening, hoping that somewhere, in the clash of ideals, there was still a common heartbeat, but every compromise felt like a betrayal to someone. Every open door seemed to close another. One day, he stood before a congregation divided, eyes filled with hope and eyes burning with resistance. And in that moment, he did not preach. He simply asked, "Can we hold two truths in the same heart?" Silence followed, a silence heavier than any sermon ever delivered, because deep down, everyone knew the answer, but few were brave enough to live it. This was his struggle. Not to choose a side, but to remind the church that unity isn't found by erasing difference. It's found by embracing it, even if the road forward feels like walking a tightrope over 1,000 storms.
Conclusion, a legacy forged in silence. And so, the story of Pope Leo XIV does not end with thunderous applause. It ends in the quiet corners, where history rarely looks. While others built monuments, he planted gardens. While some sought legacy in stone and scripture, he found his in the laughter of children and the soft turning of earth beneath his hands. in the final years of his life, you would not find him in grand halls of marble, but kneeling in a small garden, tending to fragile blooms with the same care he once tried to offer to a fractured world. When asked why he spent his mornings there, he simply smiled. Because even the smallest seed, he whispered, can change the landscape if it's planted with hope. His legacy was never meant to be loud. It wasn't carved into marble or etched across history books. It lives in the unseen, in the quiet courage to stand even when the ground beneath your feet feels impossibly fragile. In every moment, he chose grace over grand gestures, service over self-preservation, and perhaps that's the legacy that lasts longest of all, because long after titles are forgotten and monuments fade, a single tree still stands in the garden where he once knelt. A tree that reminds us greatness isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear a crown or stand beneath a spotlight. Sometimes greatness is found in silence, in the quiet hands of a man planting hope, one seed at a time.